All superheroes suck. Eventually. And the crazy thing is, this happens for the exact same reason we love them in the first place. Superman is a symbol of hope and ultimate heroism. We love him because beneath all that power, he's still a Kansas farm boy trying to understand what he can do. And then he grows. Once he masters his powers and starts taking down cosmic threats with uppercuts, we don't feel quite the same attachment anymore. Of course, it's not just power scaling, because we feel this detachment with Batman as well. He starts as a self-made superhero with no actual powers. The brooding figure, the no-kill rule, the prep time. For many people, he becomes the perfect hero. And that becomes a problem. He's so perfected as Batman that Bruce Wayne can start feeling stagnant. Then there is Hulk. We love Hulk because of the tragedy, the conflict between Bruce Banner and the monster inside him. The first few times we see that transformation, it is incredible. You feel the sadness of Banner. You feel the excitement of Hulk. But over time, the balance starts to disappear. Hulk becomes less about Bruce Banner's struggle and more about watching a giant green monster destroy everything around him. The tragedy becomes a spectacle, and that's the pattern. But then there is Spider-Man. Somehow, Marvel has kept him as one of the most beloved superheroes for over 60 years without letting Peter Parker disappear underneath the mask. And how the hell did they pull that off? I became desperate for an answer, to the point where I did what every reasonable person would do. I went through a dark ritual. I entered the rabbit hole of comics, movies, and shows. Hundreds of superhero stories later, I came out with one horrifying realization. The reason we lose attachment to superheroes is not because of their powers. It's not because of their villains. And it's not even because their stories become repetitive. The problem is usually hiding inside the very thing that made them interesting in the first place. Because almost every superhero eventually runs into one of three traps. And each one slowly destroys the exact thing that made us love them. But somehow, Spider-Man simply found a way to swing right past all three. Pun completely intended. The first of three traps is what I call absolute perfection. And Superman is a perfect example of this. When his story starts, he's not a god. He's Clark Kent, a kid from Kansas who suddenly discovers that he has abilities nobody else in this world has. And the reason we love him is because of what he chooses to do with those powers. We watch him discover his abilities, understand what they mean, and watch him slowly become the symbol of hope everyone knows today. But then something changes. Superman reaches a point where there is almost nothing left for him to overcome. He can fight cosmic beings, move planets, and survive things that would destroy almost anyone else. And slowly the same thing that made him incredible starts creating distance between him and you, the audience. Because when Superman becomes a god among insects, the struggles that made Clark Kent interesting become harder to find. Suddenly, the question is no longer how will he overcome this? It becomes what can possibly challenge him. And that's where writers start searching for ways to bring vulnerability back. Kryptonite, magic, doomsday. Or they attack the other thing Superman is almost perfect at, his mortality. That is basically what injustice does. Superman cannot save the people he loves, his perfect worldview collapses, and the symbol of hope becomes its complete opposite. And that is the problem with absolute perfection. When a character becomes too complete, there are fewer natural directions left to take them. You either keep finding bigger things capable of challenging Superman, or you break Superman himself. And once Clark Kent gets completely consumed by the symbol Superman has become, both extremes become harder for us to relate to. The second trap is called the trauma trap. Honestly, trauma is one of the strongest foundations you can give a superhero. It gives them motivation, a reason to fight, and makes every decision carry emotional weight. But sometimes, it becomes so important to the character that the story starts protecting the trauma instead of letting them move past it. And you know who I'm talking about. Batman. When Bruce Wayne first becomes Batman, everything about him is fascinating. He doesn't have powers or alien abilities. Or magic. There's nothing. Just a guy who looked at the worst thing that ever happened to him and decided nobody else should experience it. Everything about Batman grows from that one tragedy. And that's why you and I love him. But then, after enough time, something starts changing. Batman fights villains like Joker, Bane, Ra's al Ghul, the Court of Owls. And throughout the process he gets smarter, more prepared, more legendary. But Gotham is still broken. The criminals keep returning, the city keeps suffering. And every time Bruce gets close to moving forward, the story pulls him back. Maybe a tragedy, a new villain. There's always a new reason why Batman has to stay Batman. Because if Bruce completely moves past the pain that created Batman, what happens to Batman. And that is the danger of the trauma trap. When a character's pain becomes the foundation of their identity, growth starts feeling like losing the thing that made them special. Batman keeps becoming more legendary, but Bruce Wayne can start feeling like he's standing in the exact same place. And the third trap is the one that hurts the most. That, my friend, is the monster trap. It happens when the conflict inside a character becomes so important that the character themselves starts disappearing behind it. The monster's still there, it's still exciting, it's still powerful, but the person underneath starts becoming less and less important. With the clearest example being Hulk. At the beginning, Hulk feels like one of the most tragic superheroes ever created, because Hulk is not just a giant green monster smashing everything around him. He's Bruce Banner's anger, fear, and pain given a physical form. A man who wants to be left alone but is constantly forced to become the very thing he fears. And that is why people connect with him. The conflict between Banner and Hulk is what makes the character special. But over time, that conflict starts becoming predictable. Banner tries to control Hulk. Something pushes him too far. Hulk comes out, and everything gets destroyed. The first few times, it works perfectly. You feel sympathy for Banner. You understand Hulk. You feel the tragedy of someone fighting against a part of themselves. But after enough repetitions, something changes. The audience already knows what happens next. Hulk appears, Hulk smashes, Bruce regrets it. And the cycle begins again. Eventually, you stop thinking about Bruce Banner's struggle and you only see Hulk as a force of destruction. But once the monster becomes more interesting than the person controlling it, the audience starts losing the emotional connection that made them care in the first place. And that is why these traps are so dangerous. Because the same things that make a superhero iconic can eventually trap them. But somehow, for more than 60 years, Spider-Man has faced every one of these problems. And somehow he never got lost inside any of them. And this is where the difference becomes almost foundational. Because Spider-Man has something most superheroes eventually lose. A permanent connection to failure. Peter can become stronger. He can save New York, he can save other planets. Sometimes he can even save the entire universe. And somehow none of that makes his life feel easier. Because Spider-Man's tension was never built entirely around whether Peter could beat the person standing in front of him. It comes from whether Peter can actually save what matters to him. And that distinction changes everything. Because once a superhero becomes powerful enough, writers have to keep finding bigger threats. Something powerful enough to make the hero feel vulnerable again. Spider-Man doesn't need that. You can see it perfectly in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 33. Peter is trapped underneath an enormous pile of machinery. The underwater base around him is flooding, Aunt May is dying, and the serum that could save her is sitting just beyond his reach. There is no army coming to rescue him. Just Peter trying to move. And that's what makes the scene so powerful. Because the question isn't whether Spider-Man is strong enough. We already know he's strong. The question is whether Peter can push himself far enough to save someone he loves. And when he does, it shows that Spider-Man can become stronger without becoming untouchable. He can still get hurt. He can still lose. And can still make the wrong choice. And even when he wins, the victory can still cost Peter something. Marvel doesn't always need to find something powerful enough to defeat Spider-Man. Sometimes, all they have to threaten is Peter Parker. And that's how Spider-Man escapes absolute perfection. Because Spider-Man can become almost anything, but Peter Parker can still fail. As long as Peter Parker can fail, Spider-Man can never become perfect. And the reason for that is established in Spider-Man's origin story itself. Because Peter did not start out as some perfect Boy Scout. When he first got his powers, he did what most teenagers probably would. He showed off. He tried to make money. He enjoyed the fact that for once he was special. And when a criminal ran right past him, Peter let him go. Why should he care? It wasn't his problem. Until that same criminal killed Uncle Ben. And suddenly everything changed. Peter could have let that moment consume him. He could have spent the rest of his life angry at the criminal. Or even at the world and himself like a certain billionaire does. But that is not what Spider-Man becomes. Instead, Peter takes the worst mistake of his life and turns it into a rule for how he wants to live. If you have the power to help someone, then you have a responsibility to do it. And that difference is incredibly important. Batman spends his life trying to prevent others from experiencing his tragedy. Peter spends his life making sure his own mistake never happens again. Uncle Ben's death never disappears. Peter doesn't stop feeling responsible for it, ever. But the story doesn't need Peter to stay frozen in that moment. He can grow, can make friends, he can fall in love, he can laugh, and he can build a life outside the mask. And none of that makes Uncle Ben matter any less. That's how Spider-Man escapes the trauma trap. His pain remains part of him, but it never becomes the only part of him. The trauma gives Peter a direction, it does not become his destination. And here's how Spider-Man avoids the monster trap for a completely different reason. Because no matter how powerful his abilities become, Peter never gives up control over what Spider-Man is supposed to be. Think about how strange his entire concept actually is. His powers come from a spider, a creature that a ridiculous amount of people are already terrified of. Marvel could have easily pushed Spider-Man in a much darker direction, a terrifying creature crawling through New York at night. But Peter does the exact opposite. He makes Spider-Man loud, colorful, and annoying. He cracks jokes in the middle of fights, he talks constantly, and even when half the city calls him a menace, he still tries to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Because the monster is never allowed to decide who Peter becomes. And the symbiote storyline proves that better than anything else. When Peter gets the black suit, everything feels like an upgrade. It is stronger, more convenient. It makes his life easier. But then Peter realizes what is happening. The suit is changing him. It influences his choices. It's slowly taking away the control that makes him Spider-Man. And Peter rejects it, even though it makes him stronger. Even though giving it up makes his life harder again. Because strength was never worth losing himself over. That is the difference between Spider-Man and Hulk. Hulk represents the fear of losing yourself to something inside you. Spider-Man represents the choice to never let power decide who you become. He can become angry, he can become stronger, he can even come dangerously close to becoming something monstrous. But Spider-Man is always shaped by Peter's choices. And that's how he escapes the monster trap. The monster never becomes more important than the person underneath the mask. Because Peter Parker is still the one deciding what Spider-Man becomes. But Peter Parker's humanity is not protected by his choices alone. It is protected by the world around him. Because Spider-Man's world can become enormous without ever becoming impersonal. Peter can fight alongside the Avengers against aliens, gods, and world-ending threats. But the villains that define Spider-Man are usually much closer to home. You know, like Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, the Lizard, and Venom. One thing they all have in common is that they're people who can reach Peter. Norman Osborn can attack the people he loves. Otto can invade his personal life. The Lizard is someone Peter desperately wants to save, and Venom knows exactly who's underneath the mask. Spider-Man doesn't need the fate of the universe hanging in balance for the audience to care. Peter losing his job can matter. Peter missing a date can matter. Aunt May being in danger can matter. The world doesn't have to end. Peter's world just has to. And Marvel reinforces that separation in the simplest possible way. The costume turns him into Spider-Man, but the moment he starts talking, he becomes Peter Parker again. He jokes, he complains, he panics, he makes mistakes. He sounds less like a mythological superhero and more like some guy who just got out of his bed and not expecting to fight a supervillain. And that's why Spider-Man can keep getting bigger without becoming distant. Give Peter a better suit, give him new powers. Put him on a team with gods, make the villain capable of destroying a city. It doesn't matter, because a story can always bring the consequences back to one person. Peter Parker. The world around Spider-Man can keep expanding, but Peter never gets to leave it behind. And that may be the most important thing Marvel does with him. And because we actually witness Peter's life outside the mask, we become emotionally invested in his responsibility. Instead of the story telling us Peter is a good person, it makes us watch what being a good person costs him. But there is another reason Peter never gets completely trapped by Spider-Man. His responsibility never replaces his desire to simply be Peter. Because Peter was never created to be Spider-Man. He wanted friends. He wanted a normal life. He wanted love. The same things almost everyone wants. You want, I want. And that's what makes his responsibility meaningful. Unlike most superheroes out there, Peter Parker was never born to be one. He became one and keeps choosing to be one, despite everything it costs him. But there's a version of Spider-Man where that responsibility consumes him completely. Sometimes every moment of happiness he has feels selfish. His relationships become his weakness. Just for being Spider-Man, he has to sacrifice everything that makes Peter Parker human. But Marvel never lets that become the entire character. Peter still wants to be happy. He still wants people in his life and a future that has nothing to do with fighting supervillains. And that's where the real conflict comes from. Peter isn't choosing between Spider-Man and being Peter Parker, he's trying to be both. Saving someone doesn't make his personal problems disappear, and having personal problems doesn't make his responsibility disappear. The two sides of his life are constantly fighting for the same person. That's why the moments where Peter walks away from Spider-Man matter so much. He's not abandoning the hero, he's realizing that being Spider-Man is costing him the life he wanted. And when he eventually comes back, it's not because the mask has consumed him, it's because Peter Parker has decided that despite everything, this is the kind of person he wants to be. And that distinction changes everything. Spider-Man is not a symbol that consumes Peter Parker. Peter Parker is the person who gives Spider-Man meaning. Instead of his responsibility erasing his identity, it is built on top of his identity. He feels like Peter Parker, a guy who gets scared, makes mistakes, loses people, falls in love, screws up his life, and still gets back up the next day because somebody out there might need his help. And that's how Spider-Man avoided the fate that consumed so many superheroes before him. But do you know what Oda did with Zorro that made him the best secondary MC to ever exist while others failed?